I'm going to be talking about district heating. The question I sort of want to focus on in this talk is the role of regulation and the way in which sort of ideas about state activity and market activity sort of contribute to the development of energy systems, and particularly focusing on the sort of the network qualities of district heating as an infrastructure. So in the Resetting the Energy Markets workshop that Ronan mentioned that we ran, there was this quite clear sort of division between sort of two opposed sort of ideas or kind of constructions about how energy systems can be managed. And they can sort of be, the sort of labels you can stick on them as you've either got the state or you've got the market. I mean, in a way, that's a simplification, because these sort of different kinds of processes have quite, I suppose they're quite multi-dimensional. And one of the ways that you can see this is by thinking about sort of how this is played out in relation to specific parts of the energy system. So in the UK context, liberalisation focused on competition at the point of generation of energy and at the retail of energy, but of course the transmission of energy and the distribution sort of via infrastructure networks was not opened up to the same kind of competition, because it was deemed to be not amenable to that for various reasons. So, and I'm come on to some of the characteristics of networks that illustrate that. But there are certain sort of aspects in the ways in which those networks were sort of regulated as privately owned monopolies, which tried to mimic aspects of market or the sort of the economic analysis of what markets would do to, were there to be a competitive market applied. So one of those devices was a price control mechanism, which was sort of intended to simulate the effect of a competitive market on the prices that network operators would be able to charge to users of the networks. And quite interestingly, I think, I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but the ways in which energy networks are being regulated is being reformed at the moment. So there's a new framework for regulation which is called RIIO, which stands for returns equals is related to investment, incentives and outcomes. And what is quite an interesting difference there is that it's a shift away from trying to mimic the effects of a market to trying to align what happens with these regulated monopolies with the policy, the intentions of policy, so supporting greater integration of low carbon generation, for example. So just thinking about this sort of relationship between these two competing ideas, obviously the UK energy system has quite a history to it, and the ways in which it's been managed has evolved over that period. So the early development of these energy networks was characterized by competition, and there were sort of public enterprises and private enterprises in that sort of competitive market. And this led to a certain sort of formation in the ways that networks developed, which became sort of characterized as being an irrational pattern of development. So the competition between networks meant that there were, for example, different systems that operated in the same city that were not compatible. The sort of identified efficiencies from larger networks and more comprehensive networks were not being exploited, and this was something that was sort of comparisons made between the UK and the way networks were developed in other countries. Interconnection was both technically difficult because of the sort of different engineering practices that had been deployed, but also organisationally challenging because there were different sort of competing interests trying to manage and having interest in these networks. And this sort of patchwork development of networks form part of the sort of the rationale around the arguments about nationalisation, which was sort of the UK. In the UK, it was I suppose a solution to trying to standardise these systems. So, just trying to think again in terms of what were the kinds of ideas and the arguments that supported this more, what was perceived to be a more kind of rational approach to network development than a competitive market. So part of that comes from sort of economic analysis of energy networks. So energy networks are, the analysis identifies increasing returns to scale, which plays out in various ways. So having multiple networks in a single area would have higher costs than a single system. So if you had two electricity companies with the same kind of network running down a street, then that would be less efficient than having a single network that everybody used. The ways in which networks are invested in is in order to achieve those kinds of economies of scale requires sort of upfront investment in networks that have capacity that won't be used until the rest of the network's developed. So you have this kind of lumpy investment schedule, which in a competitive context is quite difficult to manage because of the risks of achieving that uptake. But then there's also, once this sort of idea of a natural monopoly has been identified and something which is then being pursued, then it arises the threat of monopoly exploitation, because you have essentially there isn't that economic pressure of consumer choice. So there's a role for some form of regulation in terms of mitigating the threat that consumers would be exploited. So they're the kind of in quite a high level, the sort of more kind of economics-based arguments, sort of focusing on the management of networks. But then there are also sort of some other ideas that sort of around that time were supported that kind of development. So one of them is sort of considering what infrastructure was and what infrastructure meant to modern society. So these ideas that the development of infrastructure represented the development sort of through these kind of metaphors of the connective tissue or the nervous system or the circulation systems of modern nations. There was also the issues of externalities. So large infrastructure has potential to create conditions of pollution. So that's one area where state management would also be justified. And then also sort of national industrial policy and the sort of Keynesian approach to macroeconomic management, having sort of this national control over networks made sense in that kind of framework, because there's I suppose it increases the extent to which government has power to intervene in the economy there. So that was just some of the ideas kind of that sort of surrounded the ways in which networks were managed and regulated around nationalisation. So now, just sort of thinking about the present, we're in a sort of very different world where energy has been, with the liberalisation of energy is sort of a very powerful part of the discourse around energy. But it's not the only one. So there's the energy trilemma, which is, as Mark mentioned yesterday, in sort of a lot of talks about energy, this is a popular word of trying to develop a system which is low carbon, affordable, and achieves energy security. It's in recent years, so in the last 3 or 4 years, district heating has become quite, well, it's moved from being a technology which has been largely sort of absent from policy debates to being something which is receiving increasing attention. There are various reasons for this. So one being that the carbon targets that the UK has set itself, sort of in the wake of the Climate Change Act, those carbon targets have actually become more stretching because of the inclusion of international aviation and shipping within the carbon targets, which are deemed to be difficult to decarbonise, so the rest of the economy has to decarbonise that much further. And also changes in the ways in which the doability of a certain vision of decarbonisation has changed. So in those kinds of analyses around the Climate Change Acts, the idea that heat would be delivered on an individual building scale by electric means has weakened due to the changing analyses of the impacts that would have on the rest of the electricity network. So there's this, that's actually quite a blurry slide there. So this image here is an update of an image that I showed at an ISSTI retreat a couple of years ago, but it's very similar. And the main point is this sort of sets out a high level what the Department of Energy and Climate Change call their strategic vision for the decarbonisation of heat. So it's organised from the bottom to the top in terms of sort of low density settlements up to higher density. So you've got the sort of city centres up at the top, and you have the sort of the dominance of gas in the middle there, and the plan is to reduce the demand for heat, and then at the top develop heat networks which would expand over time, whereas at the bottom that's where you'd see electrification of heat. So there's that analysis is based on sort of technical understandings of what district heating could be, which rely on essentially it being a network infrastructure which affords flexibility for different kinds of heat sources to be used. So there's potential to use renewable sources, quite a wide variety, and also to use residual heat from, for example, industrial processes. So that kind of like long-term vision of the way that energy networks would develop is quite different to the way that they're actually developed in practice at present. So gas combined heat and power is a sort of central technology at the moment for developing heat networks, which I suppose there's a kind of complicated set of calculations around combined heat and power in terms of the carbon savings that it achieves. But from the Department of Energy and Climate Change analysis, gas CHP only achieves quite a limited set of carbon savings, and so needs to be a kind of transition to something more, something lower carbon. So how is district heating actually being developed at the moment? Well, in the sort of in the liberalised context that we have, and with this sort of importance of markets in the way in which energy is discussed, then there's a sort of I suppose quite a diffuse set of ideas, but there isn't a kind of a central plan for developing heat networks, but a lot of experimentation and different approaches being fostered. So at Davy in 2012 at a conference said central government is not going to build heat networks for local areas, clearly. So the sort of the niches within which district heating is being developed are so I'm listing them here, but the main point, I suppose, is that quite often they're quite small and sort of related to specific kinds of opportunities. So district heating has found its way into planning policy and into the policies around the intentions that new homes be developed as zero carbon. So that's putting pressure on, or creating opportunities for new housing development. But there's also housing retrofit. So under the energy company obligation, energy companies are allowed to defray some of their obligations to reduce carbon emissions by installing district heating networks. And the main target for those are electrically heated high-rise developments. So you see, like with both of those cases, you've got quite a narrow user base. So you've just got sort of residential consumers, and also spatially these things might be quite limited too. But there are other kinds of developments which have the potential to have quite considerably larger networks. So there are university and hospital campuses. And then these kind of what I've called multi-actor projects, which try to sort of integrate, for example, a hospital and university and perhaps some local authority buildings. And these also can interact with these other kinds of developments, sort of focusing on the domestic sector. So, in a way, in the absence of an attempt to kind of impose a plan on this, these are kind of niches which are bubbling up, sort of specific opportunities that arise that might be quite difficult to align, into which these networks get inserted at the moment. The way in which district heating is regulated at the moment is, well, there isn't any district heating, so it hasn't received much regulatory attention. So it doesn't fall within the remit of Ofgem, which is the regulator for gas and electricity markets. And from an industry perspective, this creates a series of risks. So there's regulatory risk. So we see that there are where there are energy networks, that are well established, they are regulated, so investment in energy networks might be investment in a system which is going to be regulated in the future. But there's also a question of market risk, so the extent to which it's possible to recruit subscribers to a network which doesn't have the kind of regulatory protections that Ofgem affords, which has led to this sort of an idea that's sort of both within policy and coming from industry, that there ought to be some kind of regulation, and the model this is taking at the moment is that it's an industry-led voluntary consumer protection scheme. And the sort of the content of this scheme is to focus on the relationship between sort of small users, so predominantly households, and their energy supply, just in terms of that transaction and what it is that they're purchasing. So it doesn't have any relationship with that sort of wider development of networks. So the way in which it's been set out by this sort of industry panel, which is sort of currently consulting on their proposals, is to set out that the requirements should not be more onerous than for the regulated utilities. And what they mean there is that it shouldn't be more onerous than for the regulated energy suppliers. But they don't make any reference to the ways in which the networks are actually regulated. So there are sort of various sort of interpretations that you could lay over this. So one of them is that it's trying to sort of mitigate these risks, but also manage perception, because the scheme has sort of mechanisms within it to handle sort of what gets reported about district heating and what statistics are and aren't collected. But one of the things this is a sort of a regulatory process which is sort of happening within industry and kind of, I suppose, reflecting industry interests. But also at the same time, there is a regulatory process coming in from the European Union, which has sort of quite different intentions. But again, there's a degree to which it's focused on this sort of consumer relationship with the networks. So within this kind of constellation of the way that district heating is and isn't regulated, there is, I suppose, scope, or at least potential, for these networks to develop in a way which kind of echoes the sort of early patchwork development of energy networks in the UK. So this is an example from an English city, which actually I was at a meeting and raised this particular example as a potential problem, and was unaware that the person sitting next to me was actually from one of the companies that I was talking about here. He said, he sort of reassured me that this wasn't a problem and that there was a mechanism in place to deal with the issue. And then later we had a conversation and he sort of revealed what the business strategy was from his perspective. And I'll give the description. So this is an English city. There's a city centre network which is operated under concession, which has been developed since the 1980s. And the development was a sort of piecemeal expansion of this network without a kind of forward-looking plan that was sort of involved in the kind of nationalised approach to energy network development, which leads to sort of inefficiencies and ways in which that constrains the further development of that network. There's also proposed for another network. So there's a large CHP power station, biomass proposed on the outskirts of the city, and this will develop a competing heat network. So the local authority has tried to put pressure on these two organisations to come to an agreement so that their networks can be integrated and share heat. So I raised the question, well, this is an interesting case, and we will see whether it's possible under the current arrangements to sort of have that integrated kind of development. And so I was assured that this contract has been established, but then later was sort of told how it actually works in practice. So both companies are under pressure to try and connect their networks, and both companies feel sort of recognise the pressures on the other company to connect the networks. So they want to sort of develop in a way which has the appearance of making moves to allow interconnection, but actually to avoid the situation where they have to finally connect to the other company's networks, because they recognise that they're in a more advantageous position if the other company is trying to connect to theirs. So you can see that with this kind of competitive model of development, then there is this sort of scope for for a patchwork of networks to develop. I sort of don't have much time, so I suppose I just wanted to contrast the UK with the situation in Norway, where there is a regulatory frame for the development of district heating. And this was set up at a time when there was very little district heating in the UK, so there's a sort of an appropriate comparison there. And the purpose there is this, I've taken this from one of the Norwegian documents. I don't know how to pronounce it, but the translation is to achieve socially rational and environmentally acceptable development. So it's quite a different sort of set of ideas to the way in which the regulation is being pursued in the UK. So with not much time, then I'll just try and wrap up. So I think it's quite interesting to sort of think about how this this process of regulation has come about and the kinds of justifications that are applied to it. So this industry-led regulation is oriented to what the industry sees are comparisons that will be made between district heating and other energy supplies. One aspect of that is that sort of accounts for their focus on the consumer protection aspects and not really to the ways in which networks are developed, because that's kind of receded from public debate at the moment. But one of the interesting things is that the way that they're trying to do that is to establish this kind of numeric way of achieving a comparison between your district heating supply and alternative supplies. And for people who sort of assiduously read their energy bills, then there'll be something quite surprising here, in that the claim that they make is that gas heating costs you about, either gas or electric heating costs you about 20p per kilowatt hour. Whereas if you look on your energy bill, it'll tell you that gas costs you about 3 or 4p per kilowatt hour. And this is due to sort of, the complexities of the ways in which they're actually trying to make these quite different systems that have quite different characteristics comparable via this kind of price metric. But, are we sort of stuck in this kind of position that the UK has this commitment to sort of allowing sort of private sector interests to shape the future? Well, I think, it's an interesting time. May you live in interesting times in energy. The approaches, I think, are at the moment in quite a fluid phase. The UK government has a heat networks development unit, which is targeted at sort of supporting the development, but not the actual investment in heat networks. But there aren't any sort of really rigid formal targets for that unit. Its remit really is to try and get things to happen in order to generate a better understanding. So there's sort of considerable scope there to be responsive to the ways that things change. And it's not sort of anathema, even though we have this kind of this idea of a market that's so important in the UK, that actually sort of tying policies to particular spatial areas sort of has been adopted in sort of recent policy history. So I think there's considerable scope for these issues to be quite an interesting part of the resetting of the relationship between the state and the market. I'd better finish there. So, thanks.